was on a podcast a while back and we were discussing some of our more fun anecdotal stories. One of the ones I brought up that a couple of audience members said was more horrifying than funny was my time as a student teacher in the American education system. To be frank, the American education system has been a litany and intersection of a lot of really bad stuff for a very, very long time. And I could go for hours and hours on all the various issues and complex problems that were around when I was a kid that still persist to this day, even in modern times. Except they're exacerbated since I was in high school about better part of a decade ago, and most children are still walking into the same problems. Even worse because of the COVID epidemic of 2020 and 2021. So that's what caused me to make up this new project I'm working on called the All American Nightmare, a pun on the American Dream, which is taught to children in high school and middle school in some cases. The All American Nightmare is my attempt to tackle some of the issues lesser known that happen in American education. It's going to be broken up to several episodes. I currently have 15 and set up across different seasons. The issues are going to tackle things that most people probably don't know about or just simply aren't reported on highly enough. Lesser known information that needs to get spread about. To be frank, I'm not going to be able to tackle every single issue that happens with American education. There's just way too many, and the system is so broad and varied. But what I will tackle are things that I find of particular importance. That's why I'm starting this project, An All American Nightmare: The Horrors of American Education. This is the intent episode, or the pilot, where I will explain to you what topics I'll be discussing this season and what topics I won't be. I don't think it's right for me to discuss other people's stories or speak for them. In chances where I can get other people to bring forth their stories, I'll have them send me an audio clips to put into the show. In cases of racial or various poverty basis, I won't speak on that either. As a white bisexual man who grew up in moderate middle class, lower class public education, I'm not qualified to even begin to discuss the struggles of people of color in quote unquote ghetto schools, the struggles of women and boys in preparatory schools along religious lines, or the discussion of children who grew up in the South where education is pretty much left to the wilds. I'm going to now tell you about the various episodes I'll have for this season. There are some topics I can't discuss, mainly because of not finding information on them, having to pay for the information, legal ramifications, and that'll all be discussed as time goes on. But please understand that this season is not my only season. I have full intentions to make other seasons later on and tackle issues. If you feel there's a subject that needs to be discussed, please bring it up. I will also be including citations and discussions where I can get them. One of the big problems I'll discuss later on is that a lot of the topics around schooling are heavily censored and heavily kept under wraps, so finding information about them really has to come from various sources. And I will be attaining to the journalistic integrity that if a source comes forward and explains something to me, I won't out them as a source, and I'll address that when those come about. My first episode of the All American Nightmare is called Reading Between the Lines, where I'll be discussing the interrogation of students by use of the read technique and its unethical treatment in schools. Episode 2, Testing the Tests, I'll be discussing why American testing is flawed at the very fundamental level, why it's an archaic, outdated system that's been more or less hackneyed and Frankenstein together, and then be submitting my own variation on a test that I've tried out with students that seem to work pretty well. That's another concept I want to bring into the All American Nightmare. With some things that are just outright bad, I won't try to fix them. They should just be gone entirely. But for things that we have to have, testing for example, I'm always going to try and propose a better alternative that's more set and put together. Most of these will be theoretical, but something's better than nothing. I don't simply want to just attack a problem, I want to actually offer a solution. Episode 3 will be called Whitewashing the Dishwater, where I'll be bringing about the criticisms of America's whitewashed curriculum on top of it being incredibly heavily censored, and a prelude to Episode 4. Episode 4, a prepackaged curriculum, I'll be discussing companies like McGraw-Hill and Western Group, where they produce nothing but pre-made curriculums, tests, packets, textbooks, everything boiled down into a nice easy package for teachers to take. Unfortunately, I've reached out to McGraw-Hill and a couple other groups so far and have gotten nothing back from them, not even a response or the tertiary bot email that they give you, to get access to some of their curriculum to see what they're teaching students. So for that, I have to go to actual teachers on the ground and see what they can scoop me out. Episode 5, Education is Not an Enterprise, I'll be discussing how the defunding of American education by the government made them ripe targets for businesses and what I refer to as corpos. Corpos being a term reference to not only corporations, but corporate supervisors or advising teams that move into schools to help teachers, quote unquote, fix their. Episode 6, For the Union! I'll be discussing the flaws inherent in the teachers' union and tenure, along with some of my information that I had when I was student teaching. Now, to be fair, these information is a little bit outdated, but again, the teachers' unions haven't sent me new updated doctrines, so I'll have to be going on what I have and what I can scrounge up. Episode 7, War of the Wardrobe, I'll be discussing how slut-shaming is institutionally enlisted into American dress code, and how conservative-style rhetoric, or puritanical rhetoric, was built in at the very start, crushing people's individuality and assuming more or less guilt for simply expressing oneself through artistic means. This will also lead a little bit into racism and profiling along with stereotyping, but that topic I'm going to actually have someone else discuss because, again, as a white bisexual male, I really only ever got stereotyped for wearing heavy metal t-shirts and offensive graphic tees. I have no comprehension of what it might be like to be a person of color who has a t-shirt with a famous black artist that someone identifies as a gangbanger or something. Episode 8, rather controversially, is called All Guns Blazing, where I'll be discussing the concept of school shooters with a little bit of a different take than what most people have gotten on. I've discovered that the media and a lot of other groups have taken school shooters and mostly used them to push a narrative. Since I'm not paid for and this project is on my own research and development, we'll be discussing that. That'll be heavily cited with a lot of information, all of which will be found down in the description, along with a few books that I've read on the subject that I recommend. Episode 9, A Minor Talent for War, I'll be addressing America's romance of war and its education system and the military recruitment pipeline that has come out of schools in the late years. This is going to be more of a quaint concept since I grew up during the Gulf War and the war on terror. It really isn't applied now since the military has very much been told to calm down their operations, so it will be more of a retrospective look, but the concepts are still the same. Episode 10, A Parent-Teacher Association, I'll be discussing why the PTA is not so much a group of nonprofit parents helping out schools with various extracurricular activities, but rather is a short-order special interest group that allows parents to move into schools and get their moral agendas pushed when they can't do it through legal means or through the administrative means. A sort of back alley group, and that'll lead into episode 12 down the road. Episode 11, Lay Thy Artist Upon Thy Stone, I'll be outlining how conservative thought and the STEM push initiative killed creativity in schooling, creative writing prompts, artistic expression, and ultimately drained artistic styling out of schools, a very vital part of any education system, in order to perpetuate the need for more radical testing, more enforced stress on students, and ultimately was designed to be profitable, not to help students. Episode 12, Holy War, I'll be discussing the influx of zealotry being taught in schools, the science and the science classroom aspect. I'll be briefly touching on abstinence only and prayer thought in schools and the various arguments therein. This won't be a condemnation of prayer in schools. I personally don't really mind if someone has a religious bias. I myself am an atheist. However, we do have to discuss the concepts that you cannot force your own belief systems into an academic space if it's not backed up through academics. Not to mention the puritanical belief systems that perpetuate a lot of schools, the, quote, Protestant work ethic, the idea of Catholic forgiveness and contrition, and the concept of teachers being allowed to moralize with students on the grounds of sexuality or on the grounds of moral codes. Episode 13, Digital World Stone Age Design, I'll be addressing the technological gaps and failure to adapt to new tech that seems to be pervasive through most of American education. Quote, that's the way we've always done it, will be heavily criticized as it leads to nowhere but an early grave. Education isn't federally funded enough, so granted some tech systems can't really be addressed, and demanding that the schools put more money from the federal government as opposed to the federal government spending it on military projects is pretty much a well-tread topic, so I won't be jumping too much into that. I'm also going to propose a better system for addressing the technological gaps in the schooling system along with that. That one I'm still doing a lot of research on, so it's going to be a little terse by the time we get to that point, but I hope to have some fully fleshed out ideas in that time. Episode 14 will be Oversexed and Undertaught, discussing sex ed in schools, or lack thereof sex ed, a regulation by the federal guidelines, lack of consent teaching, and slut-shaming, of course, along with basically trying to break the social stigma that, boys can't control themselves and women are teases, which is complete and utter crap. Season 15 will be my final episode where I'm going to tell it Killing the Messenger. I plan to do a live show Q&A to discuss hate comments or positive comments if I have any. Discuss some topics for next season or what I will and will not do, and ultimately wrap up the project for that season with some highlights and things like that. I would like to note that this project, I'm not going to be taking any money. This entire project needs to be done by my hand and for free. I'm not going to be monetizing any of the videos, though I doubt I'll be monetized anyway. And I'm not going to pretend that this is for anything else. We'll be right into videos, no subscriptions, no personal data. All you need to hear is my voice set to the backdrop of some fun images to keep you all entertained, and the citations therein. As far as an audience, I want this video to go out to students who might be suffering from these exact same problems, and for teachers who are interested in it but can't get a hold of it. I want my words to penetrate into the heart of the American education system. Parents, teachers, students, everybody should be hearing some of the topics and hopefully trying to fix them. We're living in a new age now, and it's a new age based upon facts, science, caring, compassion, and students ultimately being one with each other. Gone are the days of the jocks giving the nerds the swirlies, the mean girls of the 90s. It's a new world, and we need to adapt for it. And that starts with addressing some of the common entrenched and institutional problems American education has seen fit to ignore for the better part of the 2 decades since I was in school and the decade since I've been out of it. That being said, I hope you all find something with this project, and I do hope you spread it around to your friends. That's probably going to be the only time I ask you to do anything in this. I'm going to ask you that if you find a video you really, really like, spread it to your friends. If you find a video you really, really don't like, feel free to take it and do a response video to it. You have my blessing. The free market of ideas and critical thinking are expressed through the sharing of ideas. And I want you all to do that. I want you to be academics when we go down this road. I want you to take what I say with a grain of salt until I can prove otherwise. I want you to treat me as if I was an educator educating you, and there's things that I've said that might be controversial. Look them up. I feel all too often that schools depend on teachers to control students rather than let them freely think. Students should be taught to disagree and to handle those disagreements civilly, but also to present evidence forward as to why it's wrong, and not take no for an answer. The let's just agree to disagree concept far often is just used by teachers who can't browbeat students into believing one thing or another on their personal views. That being said, I'm also going to always take the position of the student in most cases. If there's a discussion between teachers and students, I'll most likely bend on the student side when evidence is lacking. I simply have more trust for students than I do for educators. This project alone should be self-evidence of that. I will also be discussing on the concept that I do not believe any type of corporate outside funding should go into schools. I think schools should be funded almost entirely by the government across the board. I think federal standards should be listed in, at least benchmarks that students have to meet. And I think that ultimately, high school sports should be something that's done as a curricular activity, not as a money-making project. If any of you are students and share these with your teachers and they wish to make response videos, please understand that I can address those in the final episode of the season, but I'm going to be focusing mostly on these videos coming out probably once or twice a month. There's a lot of research I have to disseminate and a lot of background reading I have to do. There's also experts I meet with, and sometimes they have strange schedules, but there is a work schedule based upon this. As far as people who would like to contribute to it, sending me in information, links, or your own personal stories will probably be the best way to go about doing that. I haven't set up an email system yet because it just hasn't been that pertinent, but I would like to hear your stories. With that being said, won't you join me as we walk down the road away from the American dream into the all-American nightmare, the horrors of American education?